I don't approve. The boardroom went silent. Alexandra Torres, our CEO, stopped mid-presentation about eliminating my position and stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Ryan, this doesn't require your approval, she said, that consultant smile still in place. Actually, it does. I own 51% of this company. You should have seen her face. But let me back up and explain how a 49-year-old senior director of engineering ended up owning the place he was about to get fired from. My name is Ryan Coleman, and I've been at Helixion Tech for most of my adult career. I'm not the kind of guy who usually gets involved in corporate drama. I write code, fix servers, and solve problems that have actual solutions. I like systems that work, people who do what they say, and meetings that end with clear action items instead of more meetings. But sometimes the problems find you whether you want them to or not. The trouble started 8 months ago when Alex walked through our doors with her Wharton MBA and McKinsey consulting background. Her first all-hands meeting was a masterclass in business buzzwords: optimization, digital transformation, synergistic efficiency. I've been in tech long enough to know that when consultants start throwing around phrases like that, the people who actually build things are about to have a very bad time. What Alex didn't know, what nobody except our corporate counsel Pat Williams knew, was that I had a secret that went back to the 2008 financial crisis. When Helixion was facing a hostile takeover that would have meant layoffs for half our engineering team, I didn't just watch from the sidelines. I took every penny of my grandmother's inheritance, money she'd saved from 60 years of teaching elementary school in rural Ohio, and I wired it to keep this company independent. My grandmother used to say that money should be used to build something that lasts. When I saw 200 people about to lose their jobs, I figured keeping those families stable was exactly what she would have wanted. The lawyer set up Coleman Holdings to handle the paperwork quietly. I became the majority shareholder overnight, but I never took the corner office or executive parking spot that came with it. I stayed in my same cube, kept my same title, kept doing the same work I'd always done. The work was what mattered, not having your name on the door. For 15 years, that arrangement worked perfectly. The company stayed independent and profitable, and I got to keep building systems that solved real problems. Then Alex arrived with her theories about efficiency. The first few months were uncomfortable but manageable. She'd tour the engineering floor asking questions that revealed she thought of our infrastructure as spreadsheet line items rather than the foundation everything else was built on. Why do we need 3 database administrators? Can't we outsource the server monitoring? What's preventing faster cloud migration? Every question showed that she saw engineering as a cost center instead of the engine that kept the whole operation running. But I kept quiet and focused on my work. That's what you do when you've been around long enough to know that most management fads eventually burn themselves out. The real problem started 4 months ago with small changes wrapped in corporate speak designed to make them sound like improvements. My access to certain system dashboards got revoked, streamlining permissions for security compliance. Members of my team started getting reassigned without consultation, promoting cross-functional collaboration. Junior developers who'd worked on my systems for years suddenly couldn't discuss architecture decisions with me, flattening hierarchical communication barriers. Each change individually seemed reasonable, but the pattern was clear. Alex was systematically cutting me out of everything I'd built over the past 2 decades. The servers I'd configured, the databases I'd optimized, the monitoring systems I'd implemented after learning painful lessons about what happens when critical services fail. All of it was being handed over to people who'd never lived through a real emergency. Here's what Alex never understood about system architecture. You can't optimize something you don't fully comprehend. Every backup procedure, every monitoring script, every configuration setting exists because someone learned a hard lesson about what happens when those safeguards aren't there. You can ignore that institutional knowledge for a while, but eventually something critical breaks, and then everyone remembers why those components were so important. I started keeping detailed documentation, not because I was planning drama, but because I'm an engineer. When you see patterns that don't make sense, you document them. Access denials with timestamps, meeting invitations that mysteriously disappeared, system changes that introduced new failure points. Every incident went into a folder because I had a feeling someone was going to need to explain what went wrong when things eventually fell apart. The breaking point came when Pat Williams sent me a message that made my blood run cold. The board was reviewing a formal proposal to transition my role to external advisory capacity, corporate speak for pushing me out while trying to sound professional. The proposal was marked pending shareholder approval. Pat's follow-up message was 3 words: she has no idea. That's when everything clicked. Alex had been maneuvering toward this moment for months. All the access revocations, team reassignments, systematic marginalization, it was building toward a board presentation where she could point to my reduced involvement as evidence that my position was redundant. She thought she was playing chess, moving pieces until I had no choice but to resign quietly. What she didn't realize was that she needed permission from the one person who would never give it. This wasn't just about my job anymore. At 49, starting over meant explaining to potential employers why someone with my experience was available. It meant possibly relocating my family, disrupting my daughter's senior year, telling my wife that the stable career we'd built our retirement plans around was gone. It meant watching systems I'd spent decades perfecting get dismantled by people who didn't understand what they were breaking. The meeting where she called me replaceable was supposed to be the final push. Make me feel obsolete so I'd walk away voluntarily, letting her tell the board the transition was mutual. Instead, sitting there listening to her explain why decades of experience were no longer needed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger exactly, but the kind of calm clarity that comes when you finally understand exactly what needs to be done. She wanted to optimize me out of existence. She had no idea that the person she was trying to eliminate was the one person whose approval she actually needed. Sometimes the quiet guy in the back of the room turns out to be the most important person there. The next morning, I walked into the office like nothing had changed. Same time, same route through the parking garage, same nod to Jerry the security guard who'd been checking badges since dial-up internet was cutting-edge technology. But everything was different now. I wasn't just documenting problems anymore, I was building a case that could either save my career or destroy it completely. The first thing I did was pull up our system monitoring dashboards. What I found made me understand just how dangerous Alex's efficiency campaign had become. Over the past 3 months, while her team had been streamlining our infrastructure, error rates had climbed 28%. Database response times were up 22%. Most concerning, our core payment processing system, handling nearly $3 billion annually, was throwing intermittent failures that nobody seemed to be tracking systematically. This wasn't corporate politics anymore. This was technical negligence that could cost us tens of millions if the wrong component failed at peak transaction time. I opened a new spreadsheet and started logging everything methodically. Date, time, affected system, error type, probable root cause. The pattern that emerged was damning. Every significant incident over the past 3 months traced directly back to changes made by Alex's team. They were treating our infrastructure like a business school case study, moving pieces around based on theoretical cost savings without understanding the practical implications. You know what drives me crazy about management consultants? They look at a database server that's been running flawlessly for 8 years and see expensive legacy hardware that needs cloud migration. They don't see the custom indexing strategies developed after the 2011 traffic spike nearly brought down our entire e-commerce platform. They don't understand the specific memory configurations that prevent cascading failures during peak loads. To them, it's all just costly equipment that can be replaced with something newer and cheaper. The problem is, newer and cheaper doesn't mean better when you're dealing with systems that have evolved to handle real-world complexity. Every change Alex's team implemented looked brilliant in presentations, but they were systematically removing safeguards that kept our systems stable under pressure. 3 days after that replaceable conversation, I lost access to the production monitoring console. The notification came through standard IT channels, with Alex's name visible in the approval chain. Compliance with updated security protocols, the ticket explained. Translation: they didn't want me seeing how badly their changes were affecting system stability. But here's the advantage of working somewhere for decades. You know people, and people know you. When you've spent years helping other teams solve their toughest technical challenges, they remember. When you've been the guy answering emergency calls at 2 a.m. to fix critical problems, that builds relationships deeper than org charts and access permissions. 3 of my senior colleagues, Tom Brady from databases, Sarah Kim from security, and Mike Chen from networks, all started reaching out with similar stories. Alex's team had ignored their warnings about system dependencies, disabled monitoring that had prevented past breaches, and rushed changes without proper testing. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: experienced engineers getting overruled by people who mistook complexity for inefficiency. These weren't just systems to me. I'd been the one getting 3 a.m. calls when things broke. I'd explained to angry customers why their payments failed, I'd spent weekends rebuilding servers that crashed at the worst possible moments. Alex saw cost centers. I saw years of learned lessons that were about to be thrown away. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon. I was working on a capacity planning analysis, not because anyone had asked for it, but because I could see trouble coming when my workstation screen went blue. System crash. Within seconds, my phone started buzzing with messages from engineers throughout the building. The payment processing system was down. Complete outage. No transactions going through anywhere in our network. Every minute of downtime cost us approximately $195,000 in lost revenue, not counting customer service impacts and potential regulatory issues. I walked to the network operations center where controlled chaos was unfolding. 8 people clustered around monitoring screens, showing cascading red alerts, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Alex was there too, asking questions that made it obvious she didn't understand what she was looking at. "How long until we're operational?" she kept demanding. "What's our recovery timeline? Who's responsible for this?" Tom Brady was at the primary console, sweat visible despite the aggressive air conditioning, fingers moving rapidly as he tried different diagnostic approaches. I could see exactly what he was dealing with. A cascading failure triggered by database configuration changes they'd implemented the previous week. The new setup couldn't handle Friday afternoon transaction volumes, and when the primary server failed, it caused sequential failures throughout the cluster. I knew how to fix it. 20 minutes to implement the configuration rollback, maybe another 15 to verify stability. But my access had been revoked, remember? Security compliance requirements. So I stood there and watched. Watched Tom struggle with a problem I could solve without breaking a sweat. Watched Alex pace behind the engineering team, demanding status updates every few minutes. Watched our revenue disappear at $3,000 per minute, while the solution sat locked behind access permissions that had been revoked to keep me from seeing how bad things were getting. After 3 hours, they managed to restore partial functionality. After 5 hours, the system was stable enough to process transactions reliably. Total cost, $1. $4 million in direct revenue loss, plus whatever long-term impact the outage would have on customer confidence. That night, I updated my documentation with detailed incident logs, screenshots of error messages, and a comprehensive technical analysis of what had failed and why. Then I wrote something I'd never written before, a formal post-incident report identifying the root cause as database configuration changes implemented against explicit engineering recommendations. I saved everything to an encrypted drive because I had a strong suspicion that when Alex presented her case to eliminate my position, she was going to blame the outage on outdated infrastructure and engineers who were resistant to necessary change. The irony wasn't lost on me. The resistant engineer she was planning to remove was the one person who could prove exactly what had gone wrong and why. More importantly, I was the one person whose approval she actually needed to make her plan work. She just didn't know it yet. The Monday after the outage, I got a text message that made everything real. Coffee. Now, you know where. It was from Pat Williams, our corporate counsel and the only person at Helixion who knew about Coleman Holdings. Pat had been more than just a lawyer to me. She was the one person who'd watched me grow from a junior developer panicking about a hostile takeover into someone willing to risk everything for the company. When I'd called her in 2008, voice shaking as I explained my plan to invest my grandmother's inheritance, she hadn't just handled the legal paperwork. She'd talked me through the biggest decision of my life. We met at the same coffee shop where we'd discussed the original investment structure 15 years earlier. Pat looked like she hadn't slept well, which probably meant she'd been up late reviewing corporate bylaws and shareholder agreements. She slid a manila folder across the small table without bothering with pleasantries. "They're accelerating the timeline," she said quietly. "Board meeting scheduled for Thursday morning. Alex has submitted a formal proposal to eliminate your position and redistribute your responsibilities to what she calls more adaptable technical resources." I opened the folder and found myself staring at my own professional obituary, printed on official company letterhead. The document was crafted with corporate precision that made termination sound like strategic evolution. It talked about organizational modernization and resource optimization. It included a detailed financial analysis, showing exactly how much money the company would save by cutting my salary, benefits, and departmental budget. Reading it felt surreal, like watching someone describe a stranger who happened to have my name and job title. According to Alex's analysis, I was an expensive relic whose primary contribution was consuming resources that could be better deployed elsewhere. Here's the crucial part, Pat said, pointing to a section near the bottom. Board approval contingent upon majority shareholder consent. She still has no idea what she's asking for. That was the moment the full implications hit me. For months, Alex had been systematically building her case, gathering allies, preparing presentations, doing everything a competent executive should do when making major organizational changes. She'd followed proper procedures, documented every decision, built support among board members who respected her business credentials. She'd done everything right except one crucial detail. She'd never bothered to find out who actually owned the company she was trying to reorganize. "What are you thinking?" Pat asked, watching my face as I processed what this meant. I closed the folder and looked out the window at people walking past, going about their normal Monday routines, completely unaware that someone's career was balanced on a knife's edge. I'm thinking it's time to stop being the quiet guy in the back of the room. The next 3 days were unlike anything I'd experienced professionally. I continued my normal routine. Same arrival time, same system checks, same attendance at the few meetings I was still invited to. But underneath that familiar surface, I was preparing for the most important presentation of my career. The technical documentation was comprehensive. I had detailed logs of every incident that could be traced back to Alex's optimization initiatives. The $1.4 million outage was just the most visible example, but there had been dozens of smaller failures, performance degradations, security gaps, and system instabilities. Each one had been preventable if the people making changes had understood what they were changing and why the original configurations existed. But I needed more than technical evidence. I needed to explain to a board of directors, most with business rather than engineering backgrounds, why institutional knowledge mattered and why Alex's consultant-driven approach was fundamentally flawed. I spent Tuesday evening creating what I thought of as my professional autobiography. Not the sanitized version that appears on LinkedIn profiles, but the real story of what it means to keep complex systems running for decades. The Y2K remediation project that kept our servers operational when half our competitors went dark for days. The 2004 security incident we contained in under an hour because our monitoring systems detected intrusion attempts before any data was compromised. The 2011 database corruption that could have destroyed years of customer information if we hadn't implemented proper backup procedures. Each crisis had the same underlying pattern. Something unexpected happened that wasn't covered by standard operating procedures, and resolving it required deep understanding of how our systems actually behaved under stress, not how they were supposed to work, according to documentation. Alex's team had been at Helixion for less than 8 months. They'd never managed a real crisis, never had to explain to angry customers why transactions were failing, never spent 3 days straight debugging a problem that could shut down operations completely. They understood theory, but they'd never lived through the practical reality of what happens when theory meets a system processing billions in transactions. Wednesday afternoon, I reached out to my network. Not for political support, but for professional documentation of what Alex's changes were actually doing to our infrastructure. The responses were more damaging to her case than I'd expected. Tom provided detailed analysis of database performance trends, showing steady degradation since the migrations began. Sarah documented security monitoring gaps that hadn't existed under our previous configuration. Even engineers I hadn't worked with directly sent reports of system instabilities and process failures that all traced back to the same root cause, changes made without adequate understanding of system dependencies. The picture that emerged was of an infrastructure under stress, maintained by people who understood how to make things look good in reports but didn't know how to keep them working reliably under real conditions. That evening I assembled my board presentation. Not slides full of buzzwords and theoretical frameworks, but actual performance data. System reliability metrics showing clear degradation patterns. Error rate trends that correlated directly with Alex's timeline. Financial projections of what the next major outage would cost if current trends continued unchecked. The hardest decision was how much to reveal about Coleman Holdings. Pat and I had kept that arrangement private for 15 years, and making it public felt like changing something fundamental about my identity at the company. But looking at the data, at the evidence of what was happening to systems I'd spent my career building and maintaining, the choice became clear. This wasn't about protecting my job anymore. It was about protecting the infrastructure that kept Helixion operational, the engineering team that understood how things really worked, and the customers who trusted us with their transactions. This wasn't just about my career ending at 49. It was about watching people destroy something that had taken decades to build properly. It was about my daughter asking why Dad had to start over when he'd worked so hard to build something stable. It was about explaining to my wife that the retirement plans we'd made based on my senior position were gone because someone decided experience was obsolete. Thursday morning, I walked into the office carrying a folder containing 15 years of carefully guarded secrets and decades of hard-earned expertise. Alex thought she was about to deliver her masterpiece presentation. She had no idea that the person she was trying to eliminate held the one vote that could destroy her entire plan. For the first time in months, I was confident about how this was going to end. The boardroom was already 3/4 full when I arrived Thursday morning at 8:45. I took my usual spot in the back corner, close enough to see everyone's faces, far enough away that I wouldn't be noticed until the right moment. That was still the plan anyway. Alex walked in at exactly 9 o'clock, looking like she'd stepped out of a Harvard Business Review case study. Dark navy suit, leather portfolio, the kind of confident posture that announced she'd already decided how this meeting would end. Her presentation materials were perfectly organized, her supporting documents color-coded and tabbed, her allies positioned strategically around the mahogany table. She thought she was about to deliver the final move in a chess game she'd been playing for months. She had no idea she was walking into a trap 15 years in the making. The meeting opened with routine quarterly business, budget approvals, market analysis reports, procedural items that make corporate governance feel like watching grass grow. Then Board Chairman William Morrison called for new business, and Alex stood up with that practiced smile. "I want to discuss a critical organizational opportunity," she began, clicking to her first slide. "Specifically, how we can modernize our technical leadership structure to better align with industry best practices and improve operational efficiency." For the next 20 minutes, I watched her systematically dismantle my career with charts, graphs, and consultant terminology. She talked about outdated methodologies and change resistance patterns. She presented comparative analysis showing our engineering costs versus industry benchmarks. She painted a detailed picture of a technical organization led by someone whose approach belonged in the previous decade. I have to admit, she was impressive. Professional, articulate, supported by data that looked convincing if you didn't understand what you were actually examining. The board members nodded thoughtfully, asked intelligent questions, clearly taking her analysis seriously. Then she reached her recommendation slide. Based on this comprehensive analysis, I propose we transition Ryan Coleman to an external advisory capacity, redistributing his current responsibilities among more agile technical team members. This restructuring will reduce annual operating expenses by approximately $380,000 while improving development velocity and modernization timelines. Chairman Morrison looked around the room with the expression of someone preparing to facilitate a routine procedural vote. "Are there any questions or concerns before we proceed with board approval?" That was my cue. "Actually, I have several concerns," I said, standing up and walking toward the front. Every head turned, including Alex's, though her expression showed more irritation than surprise. She probably thought I was about to make some desperate emotional appeal about loyalty and years of service. She was about to learn how wrong assumptions can be. "Alex, you mentioned that our engineering costs are significantly higher than industry benchmarks," I continued, plugging my laptop into the projection system. "Before the board votes, I think they should understand exactly what those costs are purchasing." My first slide was system availability data covering 5 years. 99.94% uptime across all critical services. The second showed our transaction processing volume, $2. 8 billion annually handled without major disruption until Alex's project began. The third compared our infrastructure performance with primary competitors, demonstrating that our expensive systems actually delivered better reliability than companies spending twice as much. "These systems you're describing as outdated technologies," I said, looking directly at Alex, "have maintained continuous operation through 3 economic downturns, 4 platform migrations, 6 significant cyber attacks, and countless routine challenges. They work consistently because they've been tested against every failure scenario reality could devise. Alex's confident expression was showing cracks. Ryan, I appreciate the historical context, but this isn't the appropriate forum for detailed technical discussions. You're absolutely right, I replied, advancing to my next slide. Let's focus on business impact. What appeared on the screen was a comprehensive timeline of every significant system incident over the past 6 months, each one correlated with specific changes made during Alex's infrastructure project. The $1.4 million outage was prominently featured, surrounded by dozens of smaller failures, performance degradations, and security vulnerabilities that had been introduced systematically. Tom Brady explicitly warned that server configuration changes would cause cascading failures under peak loads. Sarah Kim documented security monitoring gaps that would be created by disabling intrusion detection systems. Every technical recommendation from experienced staff was overruled in favor of theoretical improvements that looked impressive in presentations but failed when confronted with real operational demands. The room had become completely silent except for the quiet hum of the projection system. Alex was staring at the screen like it contained information she'd never seen before. The question the board needs to consider, I continued, isn't whether our engineering expenses exceed some industry average. The question is whether you want to save money by eliminating the institutional knowledge that prevents those expenses from becoming 10 times higher when critical systems fail. Morrison leaned forward, studying the incident timeline with obvious concern. Ryan, this is valuable information, but Alex's proposal still requires formal shareholder approval for organizational changes at your level. Alex nodded quickly, trying to regain narrative control. That's correct. This restructuring is contingent upon shareholder consent, but our preliminary discussions indicate no anticipated obstacles. Pat Williams, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, cleared her throat and stood up. Actually, there might be a significant obstacle to that approval process. She walked to the front, carrying a folder I recognized, and suddenly everyone was about to learn a secret Pat and I had kept for 15 years. Ryan Coleman is the majority shareholder of Helixion Tech through Coleman Holdings, Pat announced, placing documentation on the table in front of Morrison. 51% ownership, verified and current as of this morning's legal review. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear individual people breathing. Alex's face went through what looked like 6 different emotional states in 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, comprehension, and finally something resembling panic. How is that even possible? 15 years ago, when Helixion was facing hostile acquisition that would have eliminated most of our technical staff, Ryan invested his entire inheritance to maintain company independence, Pat explained matter-of-factly. He's been the majority owner ever since, though he chose to continue in his operational role rather than assume executive control. I looked directly at Alex, and as majority shareholder, I don't approve this organizational transition. Morrison was examining the ownership documents like they contained nuclear launch codes. Ryan, if this documentation is accurate, why haven't you disclosed this ownership structure previously? Because I never wanted to be the owner, I said simply. I wanted to be the engineer who kept systems running and problems solved. But when someone attempts to eliminate institutional knowledge without understanding what they're potentially destroying, that's when the quiet engineer has to speak up. Alex found her voice, though it sounded strained. This disclosure doesn't change the fundamental analysis. The company still requires modernization and organizational efficiency. You're completely right, I agreed. And as majority shareholder, I'm promoting myself to Chief Technology Officer, effective immediately. We'll implement modernization carefully, systematically, with full input from people who understand both what we're changing and why. Alex submitted her resignation the following Monday. No dramatic confrontation, no angry exit interview, just a professional departure announcement about pursuing new strategic opportunities. As for me, I finally accepted the executive title that matched what I'd been doing all along. The corner office came with the promotion, but I kept my original cube because that's where real work happens. I've started implementing gradual modernization that respects existing infrastructure while systematically upgrading components that genuinely need improvement. Our system uptime is back above 99%. The performance issues that developed during Alex's project have been resolved. Most importantly, we've established protocols ensuring that technical changes are evaluated by people who understand both business requirements and engineering implications. You know what I learned? Sometimes being quiet isn't about avoiding conflict. Sometimes it's about being patient enough to let people reveal who they really are. And when the moment comes to speak up, you better have more than opinions. You better have facts, data, and the expertise to support every word. The systems are running smoothly now. The team knows their knowledge is respected. And somewhere out there, Alex is probably giving presentations about organizational optimization to some other company that doesn't yet realize what they're about to lose. Me? I'm back to doing what I've always done best: solving problems, maintaining systems, and keeping things running. The only difference is that now everyone knows the quiet guy in the back of the room isn't just another employee. Sometimes he's the person who owns the whole place.